Hello! We are Rachel and Michael Aubrey. We're linguists with SIL International. This video series grows out of the SIL Biblical Language Grammar Project. You can learn about how we're writing grammar for Bible translation in the link below. Today, we investigate constructions and the source path goal schema.
How do we relate spatial and abstract usage? With concrete nouns, it makes sense, from one physical noun to a different physical noun, as in Luke, do not move from house to house. But with abstract nouns, the metaphor from one abstract noun to a different abstract noun doesn't make much sense. Look at 2 Corinthians 2:16 and Romans 1:17. From death to death? Life to life? From faith to faith? This leads to two important questions. First, if the spatial usage makes sense, how do we make sense of the abstract usage? And second, can we find an analysis that motivates both the spatial and abstract meanings together? We think that cognitive linguistics provides a means of doing both. But before we can do the analysis, we need to understand two concepts: image schemas and constructions. Let's take these two ideas in turn.
Think about motion. Motion gets us from one place to another. And to get there, we follow a path and go in a direction. These are not criterial properties of motion itself, but they inform how we understand it and use it in language. This understanding is based on an image schema. What's an image schema? Image schemas are cognitive patterns that organize human knowledge about the world. Where do they come from? They arise from our bodily movements in space and time. And what are image schemas like? They're simple structures made up of related parts. We can easily manipulate them to fit a variety of contexts, and we use them to understand both concrete and abstract concepts via metaphorical mappings. The source path goal schema has constituent parts: a source, a path, goal, and a direction. Paths are part of basic human experience. Some paths involve physical surfaces, such as the path you walk to get to the bathroom when duty calls. Other paths are projected. An arrow shoots through the air to its target. Still other paths are imaginary, such as the force of attraction that propels you toward a fascinating person. All these paths have the source path goal schema as their basis. Real or imagined, all paths implicate the following parts: something that moves, animate or inanimate, a starting point source, and an endpoint goal. A path connects source and goal with a sequence of contiguous locations between them. Paths are not inherently directional in themselves, but as intentional agents in the world, we humans give them direction. As we move through space, we experience the passage of time. I start at the source at time 1 and move to the goal at time 2. A timeline is then mapped onto the path. I reach the goal at a later point than when I began. And finally, paths can be expanded, shrunk, or morphed and still connect 2 points.
Constructions are conventionalized learned pairings of form and meaning. They can be small, like the ing endings on verbs. They can be larger, like English transitivity. Consider Rachel laughed in 1. Most people would say that laugh is a simple intransitive verb, but because transitivity is expressed as a set of constructions, we can use the verb laugh in other ways. The transitive Rachel laughed herself onto the floor in 2 is meaningful and grammatical. The reflexive makes it possible to map this ostensibly intransitive verb onto the structure of the transitive caused motion construction. They are also motivated. Motivation is about why a given construction makes sense. Think about Rachel laughed herself onto the floor. The caused motion construction makes sense. It is motivated by human experiences of laughing so hard that one falls down. We also see the source path goal schema implicated, and the directionality of motion events from initiating source subject vertically down a path that ends on the floor, goal. These same motivations are in Rachel laughed milk out of her nose. embodied experiences of milk and noses and laughing and caused motion, and the SPG schema now profiling the source of the motion out of her nose rather than the goal. But both can be profiled as in for, where milk follows a complete path from nose to table. Our focus is on how the source path goal schema motivates syntactic structures with multiple prepositional phrases, specifically the juxtaposition of two prepositional phrases in a clause that specify source and goal together. Not source or goal, but source and goal.
Prepositions are relational, and the syntax reflects this. One element is chosen as the primary focus, the trajector, modified by the prepositional phrases. The other elements in our SPG, source path goal construction, are the landmark source and the landmark goal. These landmarks serve as the reference point for locating the trajector in time and space. The landmarks are the object of the source preposition and the goal preposition in syntactic structure. Trajector and landmark are standard terms in cognitive linguistics. Here, Eleazar, as trajector, is the focused element in our perception and in the narrative. He is located in space, and he flies through the air. Where did he jump from, and where did he land? The landmark source and goal prepositional phrases specify the path of his flight from the ramparts into the valley. The path between 2 points is not specified for shape or orientation. In this example, the path is vertical. The trajector moves downward with the force of gravity. But in other examples that we'll see, the path can also be horizontal, tracing the trajector's motion from city to city.
The source path goal construction is a family of constructions. Our network has a central prototype, motivated by the source path goal schema. Related constructions are then realized as divergences from the prototype in specific ways via links. This is a basic network, and as we progress, we will see it fleshed out with more detail. Let's first talk about constructions that profile the endpoints, source and goal. The prototype exists in space. It is telic and bounded, and provides a syntactic template for mapping the source path goal image schema. Consider the elements of the schema. A movable Jesus as the trajector. Caiaphas is the starting point, and the governor's house is the end point. And the trajector, movable Jesus, travels the path between these points, and the path establishes a relationship between them. Both time and space are traversed in the motion between source and goal. The trajector ends up in a distinct location at the end than where it started at the source. It is telic. Because the schema specifies motion, but no other elements of verb meaning, the prototype is readily realized with both transitive, caused motion events and intransitive, self-propelled motion events, as we can see here. Tobit moves from the courtyard into his home. A man travels from Jerusalem to Jericho.
When we zoom in on part of our network of constructions that profile the endpoints of the SPG schema, other smaller constructions can come into focus. We can distinguish these by metaphors they rely on, metaphors for source or goal, and metaphors for event types. Abstract endpoints are possible via metaphors, such as 1. Causes are sources. Motion often relies on force, a causal chain with an impetus, a direction, and motion. Outside forces can propel a trajector forward, transferring the trajector to a new location. Sources construed as the cause are the force that propels the trajector away from one location to another. In Jeremiah, he who flees from fear as the cause that propels him away will ultimately fall into the pit. And 2. Purposes are destinations. Some movements are movements toward a desired location, a destination. This desired location becomes the goal, or the purpose for our motion toward it. In Esdras B, God transferred bread from heaven, the source, toward the purpose of helping with the Israelites' famine, the goal. The SPG schema arises from our embodied experience in the world and provides the structured relationships for understanding more abstract domains of knowledge. The change of state SPG construction relies on 2 metaphors. 1. changes motion, and 2, states are locations. The landmarks are conceptually differentiated from each other. The trajector travels from one state to a different state. The source state and the goal state share a semantic frame, allowing them to be interpreted as points along a change path. The trajector's change is construed as motion, from source, darkness, to goal, light. The path is normally left implicit, but in the example from 1 Clement, the path is overtly expressed with dia. Christ is the path from darkness into light. This example illustrates how a highly abstract concept, like salvation, can be understood in terms of a basic schema from embodied experience.
Communication events rely on a metaphorical mapping. Communication is conceived in terms of physical motion. Words are objects that move from speaker to addressee. The source domain is the SPG schema, physical motion on a path from source location to goal location. The target domain is communication, usually with a fictive path. Speech comes from the speaker and travels to the addressee. In Acts 20, though, the message is likely traveling a physical path as well, via a messenger, from Miletus source to Ephesus goal. Josephus relies on a similar metaphor. Discourse topics are locations. Writing follows a fictive path from one topic to another. Josephus takes a different path to digress, and then he backtracks to where he digresses toward his next topic. The logic of the metaphorical entailments come from the inferences of the SPG schema, and Josephus's syntax reflects the semantic links in the schema.
Where previously we discussed the source path goal constructions that focused on the source and goal, we now shift our attention to the path between them. After we finished the analysis, we examine 4 case studies where the interpretation of the source path goal construction has shown some difficulty for interpreters and translators.
Constructions that profile, that is, focus on the path, rather than the endpoints, are primarily interested in what happens between the endpoints, rather than whether or not the trajector leaves the source or arrives at the goal. For these, it's more about the journey, you know?
Focusing just on the path constructions, we can zoom in and see that there are some additional extensions for both the range constructions and the iterative path construction. Range constructions take source and goal from the spatial prototype and use these as the initial and final boundaries over which an activity takes place. Range constructions measure a distance between things in space and time and abstract domains. They profile the extent of the region delimited by the source and the goal. The landmarks serve as boundary markers for the extent of the path. Iterative paths involve expressions where the landmarks are conceptually identical. Michael hops from room to room. The landmark's source and goal are conceptually undifferentiated. Though their referents are different, they refer to a different room each time Michael hops from one to the next. But because they are conceptually identical, they create a path that goes from point A to B, then B to C, and so on. They focus on the path of the trajector, irrespective of event initiation or completion. Let's examine examples of each type.
Spatial range constructions identify the range path that the trajector extends in space. The landmark designates the initial and endpoint boundaries for a scanning path. In Josephus, the source and goal mark allocation boundaries for the Levites' land. As conceptualizers, we scan a path from the wall 2,000 cubits out to the endpoints. This scanning path involves fictive motion. No physical motion is required in the scene. It is instead our conceptual scanning that supplies the path between the boundaries. The source and goal landmarks in spatial range constructions play a limiting function, profiling a bounded path trajector that exists within the span of the 2 endpoints. Severe plague extends from head to toe, and blood fills Jerusalem from one side to the other. Temporal range extends the conceptual scanning path from space to time. The conceptualizer scans a path between 2 temporal points. An event holds from one temporal boundary to the other. This relies on experiential integration of space and time in our embodied movements. When we travel a path, we arrive at the goal later than we left. time passes as the trajector moves between the boundary endpoints. The king was propped up in the chariot, starting in the morning and ending in the evening. In Matthew, 14 generations are counted between the time of Abraham and the time of David. Spatial range also extends to abstract range. Rather than measuring a path in space between two locational points, abstract ranges identify a trajector's path between two concepts within a shared semantic frame. In these examples, abstract range elaborates the meaning of the trajector all the letters, is modified by from alpha to omega, measuring a path from the beginning of the alphabet to the end. Similarly, all the people are measured from least to greatest, applying a category structure. A variety of ranges could identify the people, shortest to tallest, youngest to oldest. The range elaborates how they're being measured. Those with the lowest status or power to those with the highest. They all paid attention. Landmark, source, and goal are comparative concepts here, offering a range that increases by degree and includes those on the path between the two endpoints. Let's turn now to iterative paths.
In other types, the landmark, source, and goal express distinct concepts. Here, they're conceptually undifferentiated, identical in kind, but with separate reference. When they pursued them from town to town, we know that each town is different along the path. With indefinite nouns like city, town, or house, no specific city or instance of travel is in view, but it represents a higher order event of multiple component instances, each with the same conceptual structure. An atelic motion verb, tip, pursue, or go, is paired with an indefinite path, resulting in an iterative connotation. The profiled path is lengthened as the trajector moves. The pursuit goes from source to goal, but then that same goal becomes the source from which the pursuit continues. We also have extensions from space into time, from day to day, month to month, and year to year. A path in time is measured so that an event takes place over that time span. Conceptually identical landmarks designate an event that occurs again and again. The path is dynamic. We can measure a time span and expand it. From eternity to eternity implicates our imaginative capacity to speak about things that span all time. Temporal iterative paths are motivated by our experience of celestial cycles around the Earth as they mark a sequence of points along a path from one to the next. Iterative paths extend from space into abstract domains. In the first example, the Lord's people went from evil to evil. The SPG schema provides the structure for understanding a more abstract concept. The people, trajector, travels on a path from a source evil to a goal evil. Their conceptual identity specifies a type of activity they are engaged in. It does not pick out a particular instance of evil, but makes a generic statement about an iterative path from one type of evil to the next. In the second example, a kingdom trajector is transferred on a path from people to people. The dia phrase makes the path explicit through unrighteousness, insolence, and wealth. By activating an indefinite iterative path, the speaker need not specify a particular kingdom, but engages a conceptual idea about the morality of the nature of the world generally. Kingdoms are transferred in this way.
Aristides' Quintilianus offers an extended iterative path. Attention here is on the change in modulation. The landmarks do not designate a single instance of rhythm change, but instead a higher order event of multiple instances of the same type, rhythmic modulation. These are classes of such modulations. Aristides uses an iterative path to describe his analysis of the category structure of rhythm change. Their conceptual similarity exists at different levels of categorization. Many of these types represent SPG pairs with distinct lexical forms. They are, nevertheless, of the same conceptual kind at a higher order of categorization, forming a frame. Thus, we get same landmark tokens from erratic to erratic, or from mixed to mixed, and different landmark tokens, from structured to erratic, and from incomposite to mixed. Any single instance with a specific rhythm change isn't in focus. What is profiled is the change itself, which functions in the role of path, across multiple instances. We conclude with a few case studies, examples that have caused difficulty for interpreters and translators.
Psalm 83 is about worshippers traveling to Jerusalem. Verses 5 to 7 speak of the travelers finding their strength in the Lord as they travel. They find waters from springs and from pools of early rains. This is a journey through arid lands to Jerusalem. The water refreshes them. They go from one place of strength then to another place of strength as they travel in the Lord's blessing. The landmarks are undifferentiated and indefinite. The motion verb moves the trajectory from one point to the next as an iterative path. Romans 1:17 is also an iterative path. Recall verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. In the gospel, God's righteousness is revealed from one person who has faith to the next person who has faith and to the next. 2 Corinthians 2:16 is a creative example of the range construction. The range is the smell path that travels between the smelly, smell-y source and the smell-er goal. To those being saved, it is the smell of life, a fragrance from life to life. And to those who are perishing, it is the smell of death, an odor from death to death. The smell itself functions as a range path between source and goal landmarks.
This example in 2 Corinthians 3:18 is traditionally interpreted as meaning from one degree of glory to another degree of glory. However, same landmark SPG constructions are consistently realized only as range or iterative path constructions, never change of state. And ranges of degree require degree landmarks. If Paul had wanted to say from one state of glory to a different state of glory, there are any number of ways he might have done that, but he didn't. The choice of using the same landmark explicitly removes the degree interpretation from the table. So let's think about the context of 2 Corinthians 3, a contrast between Old and New covenants. Moses experienced God's glory, but it faded, verse 7. Christians reflect God's glory, and it never fades, verse 10. Moses delivered God's law with a veil over his face, verse 13, and that veil still exists, covering the minds of those who hear the Old Covenant, verse 15. Christians, though, have the veil taken away, and are reflecting the same image just like Moses did, verse 16. Paul says followers of Christ see and reflect the Lord's unfading glory. The phrase, the same image, is normally taken as the object of the verb transform, encouraging the degree interpretation. But there's a problem here. Metamorpho never expresses transform into X with a bare accusative noun phrase without a preposition, like the same image is. It makes more sense that the same image refers to the reflection of the glory of the Lord. Reflections, of course, are images that are the same. Once we realize this, the meaning of from glory to glory also becomes clear. Reflective surfaces provide a perception range path between the source landmark and the same goal landmark, the unfading reflection of the same image. If you know the range construction, then you recognize the phrases. Reflecting the glory of the Lord, the same image, from glory to glory, are re-articulating the same concept. Paul presents an image of Christians' faces as mirrors. In Paul's framing, when anyone looks at them, they see a reflection of God's glory, from the glory in the mirror to the glory of the Lord, the same glory.
Our complex network of SPG constructions has a number of organizing properties. In the center is the spatial SPG prototype. The center line marks 3 distinct spatial types. Extensions from space to abstract domains are above the center line. Extensions from space to time are below the center line. The source path goal schema is implicated in our network of constructions. The schema constitutes a dynamic structure made up of related parts that form a coherent whole. It is possible, then, to put into focus or to zoom in on different aspects of the schema and then map it into a wide variety of contexts, thus giving a structured coherence to our varied human experiences. Its schematic internal structure, with constituent parts, a source, A goal, a path, and directionality allows us to highlight different aspects of the structure within a frame, profiling source, goal, or path. The spatial prototype profiles the trajector's movement between a distinct locational source and a locational goal. The trajector ends up in a different location from where he began. Metaphorical extensions rely on the same profiling pattern, but in different domains of knowledge. Change of state SPG constructions adapt the schema via the metaphors states are locations and movements are changes. The trajector's movement is a path of change from one state to another. Thus we move from darkness into light, with the SPG schema providing the necessary structure for us to talk about and understand abstract concepts of change. Communication maps onto the SPG schema as well. The source is the speaker, sending a message of words along a path to a goal, the audience. Speech follows a path from speaker to addressee. Range constructions arise from our ability to map the SPG schema onto static spatial scenes. They do not follow the trajector's motion, but instead, the source is a starting point for measurement to an endpoint. From harbor to harbor, it was about 30 stadia. The same process may then be applied in both temporal and abstract domains. The flexibility of the SPG schema allows us to understand a variety of measured paths in space, in time, and with abstract concepts. Finally, iterative path constructions expand the schema to a larger scale as a higher order event, where the schema is repeated or extended indefinitely. The source and goal are de-emphasized as conceptually identical and indefinite placeholders for actual reference. Conceptually identical landmarks make it possible to put the SPG schema back to back and to get an iterative path as we walk from house to house in our neighborhood. The same cognitive pattern allows us to do the same with time. Using the same temporal landmark, we can talk about how often repeated activities take place in our lives. Some things we do from day to day, others from month to month or year to year. More abstract iterative paths like the people went from evil to evil rely on the same schematic pattern. People who go from evil to evil can always be counted on to be up to no good, regardless of the current evil behavior. In all cases, the SPG schema, with its internal structure and constituent parts, provide a schematic basis for understanding a whole variety of different event types in human experience, from concrete events to the most abstract of ideas. These are then all realized in Greek with a family of language-specific constructions. It is a powerful cognitive pattern that we use every day to understand the nature of our world. We conclude by emphasizing one final characteristic of grammatical constructions. Constructions are interrelated, something we see in detail here. Adele Goldberg calls them a highly structured lattice of interrelated information. It should come as no surprise, then, that our constructions illustrate prototypical structures. Because they are form-meaning patterns, they readily schematize across domains. As a result, they also form a network of relationships and hierarchies. The way they extend across domains and form relationships guides their interpretation when creative or novel instances of language use appear. Speakers and hearers understand creative usage because it integrates into the network, whether that's from faith to faith, or from life to life, from death to death, or glory to glory.
We did it.